Hey guys, what's up? Sci-Hi here. First of all, happy 420 if you're watching this on the day this video is uploaded. Otherwise, if not, happy whatever day it is you happen to be watching this. But anyways, we're here for another deck tech. In this specific video, I want to talk about the concept of trying to take two archetypes or two different decks, mashing them together and seeing if the result is just pure jank and crappy, or hopefully we create something that is maybe a new archetype altogether, or something that kind of leverages the power of each archetype and forms something perhaps even stronger. So what I'm talking about specifically this time for mashing two decks together is the Mardu vehicles kind of Greasefang combo that has emerged with the last set, as well as the Reanimator type decks. Now, I've been surprised to see, at least in what I've seen, not anyone really trying to mash these two decks together. And I feel like there is an opportunity, some kind of spillover or overlap in the strategies, in that it kind of makes sense to try to go for both strategies in one deck. So without too much talking, let's just actually go look in and take a look at what I'm actually talking about here. And take a look at an Esper list first of all. I'll try to run through this rather quickly because it's pretty straightforward, pretty all in. And if you've watched any of my previous videos, you already know my feelings and concept on Reanimator in general, but we'll cover the basics real quick about what I like about the deck, what I don't like about the deck, and go from there. But without further ado, let's dive right in. So Esper Reanimator, obviously the core strategy is dumping as many cards into our graveyard as possible, filtering cards, using powerful reanimation effects like Unburial Rites that we can cast from our hand as well as from flashback in the graveyard, as well as Priest of Fell Rites for reanimating powerful bodies or creatures back from the graveyard back into play. And the great thing about these cards is, of course, they operate out of our hand in play in the case of Priest of Fell Rites, as well as in our graveyard. So we get a lot of inevitability as we're just flipping cards into our graveyard. We're going to be able to cast them from there as well. And the main goal is, of course, to put either Ulamog into play or Serra's Emissary, which kind of cover two different aspects. Serra's Emissary, of course, being the historic bomb powerhouse. Not only a really quick clock to kill your opponent at 7/7 flying, but just an incredible defensive creature, especially in best of one where you're up against a lot of aggro heavy creature based decks. You name creature and you just pretty much defend yourself from anything your opponent is going to be able to do to you and win the game from there. Whereas Ulamog, much more safe card against sweepers, as well as an alternate win condition if for example, maybe your opponent also gets protection from creatures, has their own Serra's Emissary, maybe they've got the 9 lives Solemnity combo, or some way they've soft locked you or hard locked you out of the game. You can, of course, use Ulamog's attacking ability to exile the top 20 cards of your opponent's library, deck them, and win from there. So that's the reasoning behind the 4 Serra's Emissary and 4 Ulamog. There are primary targets to reanimate with Priest of Fell Rites or Unburial Rites, and then much of the rest of the deck is putting cards into the graveyard so that we can find these things and actually reanimate them. And when I looked at this list and other Greasefang vehicles lists, we noticed that there's a lot of similarities between the vehicles decks in that they obviously they're trying to put something into the graveyard as well, specifically the Parhelion II, like the strongest vehicle in the game maybe, where you're reanimating this with Greasefang, of course, and then using Greasefang to crew it, attack your opponent with a 5/5 flyer, also creating 2 4/4 angels that are attacking for 13. It gets returned to your hand, and then you've got 2 leftover 4/4 angels. So incredibly fast, busted, unfair move for sure to win the game very quickly. And what I love about this is with Reanimator, we are already obviously putting tons of things in the graveyard and being able to reanimate things. And I just was thinking, well, why wouldn't Greasefang make sense here? Now we have an even more potent, fast way to win the game Of course, I've talked about we've got the defensive abilities of Serra's Emissary and Ulamog for kind of alternate win conditions, and these just being powerful cards in their outright. But now we have an even more powerful, fast, aggressive toy to reanimate and get into play very quickly. So obviously, we can't use our traditional reanimation effects on the Parhelion directly, but when we're putting so many things in our graveyard and drawing cards, we have several new avenues now that we can do busted things. For example, early on in the game, you're of course going to be casting your Stitcher's Suppliers, dumping things into the graveyard, as well as Otherworldly Gaze for putting many things in the graveyard, as well as just great selection to kind of stack the top of your deck. Make sure you hit your land drops or find the necessary cards you need. But when we add to this list, once we add Greasefang and Parhelion, we've got just that much more inevitability of just busted things to do. For example, we're casting Otherworldly Gaze on the first or second turn. We can see exactly what the top 3 cards are and what's going on. Maybe we find a Parhelion, we dump that in the graveyard, and we also find a Greasefang. We can leave that on the top of our deck rather than put it in the graveyard and just plain hard cast this outright on the 3rd turn and do our busted Parhelion play straight away. Moreover, with all this inevitability of reanimating things, reanimating Greasefang is a totally legitimate thing as well. So this functions almost like a 12th monster in addition to the Emissaries and Ceaseless, Ulamog Ceaseless Hungers. So if we find that Greasefang gets into the graveyard, that's totally fine because we can reanimate him, and assuming we have a Parhelion also in the graveyard, that's just another way to enable this busted play. And if you look at the traditional Mardu vehicles or Esper vehicle lists, they're also, some of them are running reanimation spells, specifically the 2 casting cost one, of course forget the name right now, but where you can reanimate a creature with, I believe, casting cost 3 or less or something like that. So they're already kind of doing that, but we kind of just get that benefit for free when we're already the Reanimator archetype and we just shove Greasefang and Parhelion in here. It just adds such a new potent threat to this inevitability, like I keep saying. Now, we can even do this pop off as early as turn 2 with kind of the God draw. For example, we have a turn 1 Stitcher's Supplier, and suppose that we get lucky and that dumps Parhelion, 1 copy of Parhelion or more into the graveyard. Now on turn 2, if we're ultra lucky and we have 1 copy of Phyrexian Tower, which we have in the deck, we can play this on turn 2, and assuming we have another white source as well, for instance, our first land was a Godless Shrine or something to play Supplier. Turn 2, we now have 3 mana with the Phyrexian Tower, sacrificing the Supplier, which is also going to dump 3 more cards into the graveyard, just adding the probability that Parhelion is going to go in the graveyard, or any other creature for that matter. But then say we've got Greasefang already in hand, cast Greasefang on turn 2, and now you've just successfully, turn 2, put a Parhelion into play. You're attacking for 13 damage on turn 2, leaving 2 angels behind. That's going to be hard for almost any deck to come back from. Now, so covered the basics of the deck. Of course, we didn't talk about Faithful Mending, just another enabler for more cards in the graveyard, more flashback. So the deck has insane inevitability. There's so much card selection and just dumping so much crap into the graveyard that you're gonna find this stuff. Some of the Mardu decks have like a Goblin Engineer to outright find the Parhelion. We're Esper here, so we're not doing anything like that. But just the amount of things, of filtering cards and stuff dumping in the graveyard, like you're gonna find these effects and you're gonna do something busted relatively quickly. Now, so again, like what I've said, I love that aspect of all the power. What I don't like about this particular build per se is obviously we are all in on the graveyard combo plan, But that's kind of on purpose and deliberate. If you've been following along a lot of my decks, I really like to exploit kind of very streamlined decks that are very focused on trying to do one very powerful thing, especially in the best of one ladder, and just exploiting that, doing as most powerful thing you possibly can as quickly as possible, and just winning quick games for fast ladder grinding, rising up in the ranks as quickly as you can, getting out all your daily quests and gold, and just farming gold as fast as possible. I definitely like to win fast and efficiently. So this could be absolutely awesome and just wreck decks that have no way to answer graveyards. Of course, on the flip side, being that we're all in with the graveyard plan, it can be really difficult, if not impossible, against some decks if they've got very potent anti-graveyard effects. For example, it can be possible to defeat some things. Like you can survive one Tormod's Crypt or a couple activations from Scavenging Ooze. But if your opponent starts to get, with Scavenging Ooze, for example, too much green mana, and they can just on demand answer anything in your graveyard that you try to target or do, that can be pretty much impossible to overcome. If that is the case, the deck's not completely dead. You can still kind of hang around and survive and try to play a fair game and actually start hard casting some of this stuff, because the game will slow down a little bit where they're trying to answer all your graveyard threats, and you can actually fight through that to some extent and play a fair game and just start actually casting these things rather than reanimating them from the graveyard. As well as like one hit from a Tormod's Crypt early. If you try to do something, your opponent answers it, maybe they've got a lantern, they exile everything from the graveyard, you can still overcome that and just keep adding more material into your graveyard and hopefully do something busted relatively soon after that. However, if your opponent does get some really powerful anti-graveyard tech going, like they get, again, a Tormod's Crypt, but maybe this time they've got an Emissary, Lurker of the Loch, or whatever it's called, where they can start reanimating that Crypt or Lantern over and over again every turn, that's pretty damn impossible to deal with if we're this focused on the graveyard. But that's just something we're going to have to accept if we're going to go over the top and go all in on a graveyard plan like this. And that can be okay. This is a deck that you can really just kind of murder the ladder if you find you're in a meta, or we get to a place where people start to relax the anti-graveyard effects. A deck like this can really just crush a lot of decks and kind of just embarrass people and just make them look foolish and just not ready for something this powerful. So it's not impossible, but again, very difficult to overcome a lot of graveyard hate. Given that, we could, of course, position the deck for best of 3. We could have a lot more cards we could add to the sideboard that could answer common anti-graveyard cards that we see. In addition, there are other things we could skim. We could reduce some of the effects down a little bit, run some cards in the main to try to deal with some of these anti-graveyard cards. There's various answers that we could decide to run. Won't get into those for now. Just wanted to share this highly potent, focused graveyard Reanimator deck that also exploits the powerful Greasefang combo with Parhelion. This deck's a blast to play. Games are decided relatively quickly. If your opponent's not prepared for this, you just blow them out very quickly. Whereas if they do have very strong graveyard removal, the writing's kind of on the wall, where if you can't piece something together, it's probably best just to move on, accept it and move on to the next game, and hopefully crush the next person you play because they don't have anti-graveyard cards. So of course, this is the Esper version. There is, of course, a Mardu version as well, which is very similar, mana base, very similar, except for just obviously we're in Mardu colors, all Mardu dual lands. Still got the singular Phyrexian Tower for the chance of doing the busted turn 2 Greasefang combo with Parhelion that I described earlier, where you get the Stitcher's Supplier turn 1, hopefully putting Parhelion in the graveyard, and then casting Greasefang on turn 2 with the help of a Phyrexian Tower. Now, the Mardu version that I've got here, very, very similar, almost identical cards, except for, of course, we're using the red versions of the cards to draw and discard, get things into our graveyard. So we've got the all-powerful Faithless Looting, which is one of the best cards in the game for this kind of archetype where we're wanting to draw cards, get things into the graveyard, as well as be able to discard things we have in our hand, especially like Parhelion or Ulamog or Serra's Emissary, where we can't really do much once they're already in our hand. We want to pitch them as soon as possible. So we've got Faithless Looting. Also, for Mardu colors, we, of course, are using 4 copies of Thrilling Discovery. No flashback on this, but 1 white, 1 red. We also gain the 2 life, discarding 2 cards, but then we get to draw 3 cards. So, interesting little twist compared to the Faithful Mending, or whatever it's called, in the Esper list. Also, in the Mardu list, the only other change, I have skimmed down 2 copies of Ulamog and tried out a couple copies of Goblin Engineer, just for the absolute certainty and deterministically just getting Parhelion II into the graveyard that much more consistently. Haven't experimented with this version as much, so I may find that this is overkill and just trying to get too cute. The inevitability is maybe strong enough that maybe, in fact, I'd rather just have a couple Ulamogs. But, you know, it's kind of strange. Like, you could, in really strange situations, you may even be, if you had nothing else to do, you could reanimate this from the graveyard, just to have it hit play and then get a Parhelion into the graveyard that way. Hopefully that's not what you're doing. Things probably didn't really function as efficiently for the archetype if you're doing something like that, but it's such a powerful card that I just wanted to try running a couple copies just because it's so inevitable to put that in. However, I think it may not make a lot of sense just having it for this sole reason. This card may be better utilized when you have other artifacts and toys to kind of gain value with that way. Nevertheless, though, there are a couple copies just to guarantee you really get this into the graveyard quickly. It's just something to play around with the Mardu list. Not really sure which list I like better. The Esper or the Mardu lists they're so similar, but from what little I've played the Mardu one, I still kind of just feel like I enjoy Esper more. I like the Otherworldly Gaze is just a really interesting, powerful card. Interesting as we can play it as an instant too, so we can kind of feign or pretend we have counter spells, just do everything at instant speed to give our opponent that much less time to react to what we're doing. And the flashback is particularly nice as well. Also, Faithful Mending, nice that it has flashback as well. That gaining 2 life is very welcome, especially when we're running so many dual lands, many of which are shock lands and do deal us 2 damage if we need to put them into play untapped, which we often do, as well as the Priest of Felrites. Totally busted, efficient reanimation card, but the pay 3 life does hurt quite a bit and can be relevant. So I do really like that we have a card that can gain us life and also has flashback, so we can use it again to gain the life again. But that's it in a nutshell. Let me know what you guys think. How silly is this? I've played it a little bit, been pleasantly surprised with just how potent and powerful it is. And again, just to sum up, like, to me, it just seemed like a natural fit to jam these 2 archetypes together, because you're already in Mardu vehicles or Greasefang vehicles, whatever variant. You're already kind of doing a reanimation package already, where you're wanting to discard cards and putting this vehicle in your graveyard. So why not add it here and have the added benefit of all these other reanimation effects and discard effects, just to make it that much easier to get this vehicle into the graveyard, as well as the chances where things just line up differently, and maybe your Greasefangs were the things that went into the graveyard. Well, that's okay, because again, now you still have these 8 potent effects to reanimate Greasefang, which in turn then reanimates Parhelion II, and you just smash face for like 13 damage. So it's Really cool deck. Absolutely punishing for decks that are unprepared and don't have any way to interact with the graveyard. Even if they can interact with the graveyard, if it's not consistent enough and they can't sustain graveyard pressure, you can still sometimes manage to just get enough material in that they can't cover everything. And you can force their plays by trying to reanimate. Maybe they run out of graveyard removal and you get them the next turn. So you can still fight through graveyard removal. It is certainly challenging though. But again, if they don't have graveyard removal, most of the time they're pretty much effed when you're running something this strong and quick. So really fun deck. Greasefang is a really powerful card. Again, putting this vehicle into play via Greasefang is a really powerful move and win the game just that much more quickly. And lastly, one thing, the traditional Greasefang list, it's a really fast clock, but none of those decks had anything like defensive wise as powerful as reanimating like a Serra's Emissary, just to shield yourself from creatures or whatever threat you're up against at the time. So I really love that you now have this kind of trifecta or holy trinity of just badass monsters to put into play, whether it's, again, the defensive but powerful Serra's Emissary, the alternate win con in Ulamog, and just a bomb of a card outright anyways, 10/10 indestructible. It's not going to be swept away by anything. And then now you have this perhaps even more busted Parhelion reanimation effect of just putting in so much damage quickly and leaving a bunch of angels behind. So really cool, powerful, fun deck to try. Definitely let me know what you think. Let me know if there's any cards I'm missing. Other aspects about the vehicle decks that I may have overlooked. But again, this is just kind of mashing two archetypes together to see if we can get something that can actually stick and actually be powerful. And from what I've tested and tried this, I was actually pleasantly surprised. Like again, just the ways that you can get something into play are vast. There's so many different combinations that your opponent is always on their heels worrying about what's going to go in the graveyard next, what's going to get reanimated. And again, if they don't have any way to interact with the graveyard, they're pretty much screwed. So that's that, guys. I hope you like this little idea, something fun to try on the ladder. Definitely had some success with it from what little I've tried it so far. So let me know what you think. Until next time, good luck on the ladder, guys. Happy 420 and peace.